We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This often quoted statement from the Declaration of Independence was authored by a young 33-year-old delegate to the Second Continental Congress in 1776. The delegate, Thomas Jefferson. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the Declaration of Independence, the circumstances that led to it, and the impact it had on the rest of the world. Well, prior to 1763, the colonies operated with a high degree of independence. While they were legally bound to the British Crown, Great Britain practiced an unofficial policy known as salutary neglect, and during this period, the colonies were left to manage their own internal affairs. Salutary neglect. Why? There were two primary reasons for this. One was that it helped Great Britain focus on its wars in Europe. And second, Great Britain firmly believed that if these colonies were left alone, they would flourish and generate more wealth for the empire. But all of this changed in 1763. On October 7, 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which formally ended the French and Indian War. It was a 7 years war, and via the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain gained massive new territories from France, stretching up to the Mississippi River. But wars are expensive, and after all the celebrations were done, Great Britain realized that they were left with a massive debt from the war. So to recoup some of the debt, British Parliament, in March of 1765, passed the Stamp Act. The Act required the citizens of all the American colonies to pay a tax on nearly every piece of printed paper they used. Printed paper. What does that mean? Well, the colonists were required to buy revenue stamps from the government to apply on legal documents like wills, contracts, deeds, and mortgages, on media-related items like newspapers and pamphlets, and even items of entertainment like playing cards. The Stamp Act impacted ordinary citizens directly at the point of sale, and this sparked a massive outrage. And this gave birth to the iconic slogan, "No taxation without representation." The colonists were not objecting to the cost of the tax, but the constitutional principle behind it. The colonists could not elect members to the British Parliament, and because of that, they argued that the British Parliament had no legal right to tax them. The protests came to the streets, and groups like the Sons of Liberty led from the front by intimidating stamp collectors and using mob violence and effigy burnings to force the distributors to resign. But it was the Daughters of Liberty who hit Britain where it hurt the most: the economy. Loosely comprised of colonial women, the Daughters of Liberty focused on boycotting British fabrics, and they organized the highly publicized spinning bees to manufacture local clothing. So dozens of women would gather in town squares, churches, or the homes of local ministers to spin yarn from morning until night. Suddenly, wearing homespun clothing became a badge of honor and a public declaration of political resistance. Wait, where have I heard this before? Boycott of British fabrics and a switch to locally spun yarn. India's Mahatma Gandhi took this page from America's struggle for independence while creating his strategy for Indian independence. Gandhi was very influenced by this economic boycott of British goods and stated, even as America won its independence through suffering, valor, and sacrifice, so shall India, in God's good time, achieve her freedom. The biggest impact, though, was that for the first time, the colonies came together to formalize a unified political response to this policy. Delegates from 9 colonies met in New York to draft a formal petition to King George III. And it worked. In March of 1766, the Stamp Act was officially repealed by the British Parliament, almost a year after it was passed. There were widespread celebrations in America, but these did not last long. Within a year, in July of 1767, British Parliament once again tried to assert its authority by passing the Townshend Acts. These acts were legislation to tax the goods imported by Americans from Great Britain. Wait, after witnessing widespread protests against the Stamp Act, the British suddenly believed that the Townshend Acts would be successful? Well, they just misread the protests and drew an incorrect conclusion. Actually, in 1766, Benjamin Franklin testified before the British Parliament and stated that Americans opposed internal taxes, that is, direct domestic taxes on everyday items like legal documents and paper. So the British head of Treasury, Charles Townshend, took Benjamin Franklin's words literally and designed the taxes strictly as an external import duty on goods like glass, lead, and tea. So when it came to implementation, there were 2 things that were different. One, since these were import duties, the duty was collected from the merchants at the ports, meaning the tax was quietly folded into the overall retail price of that product. So the common citizen did not explicitly have to pay that tax. And second, the British established a proper administrative machinery for the enforcement. The Stamp Act relied on local, unprotected colonial tax collectors, and they were easily intimidated by the Sons of Liberty. But with the Townshend Acts, the British set up the American Board of Customs Commissioners in Boston and created powerful vice admiralty courts to try violators without a local jury. The thought was that by bypassing sympathetic local American courts, compliance could be better enforced. The British did one massive miscalculation. The passage of the Stamp Act had led to the colonies coming together, and a gradual evolution of political thought had occurred, which viewed any new taxation with a lot of skepticism. The American colonies now firmly believed that any attempt by the British to raise revenue without colonial representation was unconstitutional. But why choose Boston for setting up the American Board of Customs? Well, for starters, Boston was a major port. But more importantly, the British felt that Massachusetts was the epicenter of colonial resistance. And colonial resistance didn't mean just protests against the British-imposed taxes. The real issue was the presence of a highly organized underground economy that existed in Boston to bypass Great Britain's trade regulations and high taxes. Molasses were smuggled in massive quantities and supplied to Boston's highly profitable rum distilleries. The colonists also smuggled massive amounts of cheap tea from the Netherlands every year, primarily to undercut the heavily taxed tea supplied by the British East India Company. And then there were the luxury goods like wine, silks, linens, glassware, which were regularly smuggled from the French and Dutch traders. So with the establishment of the American Board of Customs, the smuggling activities got curtailed significantly. Right? Nope. On the contrary, the smuggling activities received a massive boost. Massive boost? How? First of all, the newly appointed customs commissioners turned out to be highly corrupt. So bribing them to allow the flow of smuggled goods led to the flourishing of the underground economy. And secondly, after the establishment of the Board of Customs, purchasing smuggled goods became a patriotic act of political resistance. And as certain individuals made a lot of money through this underground trade, they slowly started gaining prominence as political figures in this public resistance against taxation. And these figures included people like John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who made an immense fortune via this underground economy and used the money to directly finance the Sons of Liberty and their resistance against the British Crown. And as the underground economy continued to flourish, the Massachusetts House of Representatives circulated a letter written by Samuel Adams, which urged all colonies to unite and boycott British goods taxed under the Townshend Acts. The British government in London ordered the Massachusetts legislature to rescind the letter, but they refused, and the royal governor promptly dissolved the colonial assembly. Now, faced with this growing political rebellion, the British Secretary of State for the colonies ordered the army into Massachusetts. So on October 1, 1768, the first wave of roughly 2,000 British army men landed in Boston, making the city appear like an occupied military state. This made matters worse and escalated the political and economic tensions between the colonies and the British government. The presence of the British troops in Boston led to tensions rising to a peak, which ultimately culminated in the Boston Massacre of March 1770. On March 5, 1770, as tensions continued to increase between the soldiers and the Bostonians, a group of around 300 to 400 people surrounded a group of British soldiers and pelted them with snowballs, chunks of ice, oyster shells, and heavy wooden clubs, creating a massive chaotic scene. And amidst the chaos, the British soldiers fired back. 5 Bostonians were fatally shot, and among them was the first casualty of the American Revolution, an African and Native American sailor named Crispus Attucks. The Boston Massacre was a massive turning point with respect to the American public opinion about the British. Local leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams branded this event a bloody massacre. Paul Revere created a famous, highly inaccurate engraving that depicted the British soldiers standing in an organized line, cold-bloodedly firing on peaceful citizens. And this powerful piece of propaganda was distributed throughout the colonies, turning it into a massive unifying force against British tyranny. And in a striking historical coincidence, British Prime Minister Lord North introduced a proposal to partially repeal the Townshend Acts on March 5, 1770, the exact same day the Boston Massacre took place across the Atlantic. Charles Townshend, the original architect of the Townshend Acts, had died suddenly in 1767. And by 1770, Lord North, the new Prime Minister, started looking for a workable solution to de-escalate the explosive tensions in the colonies. North was able to convince Parliament that taxing British manufactured goods exported to their own colonies was economically foolish. News in those days took several weeks to reach London from the American colonies, so the British were completely unaware of the Boston Massacre when they introduced the bill in Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. On April 12, 1770, the Townshend Acts were officially repealed. But the tax on tea remained. Wait, what? Yes, Lord North insisted on keeping the tea tax purely as a political statement to prove to the colonists that British Parliament still held the absolute sovereign right to tax them. But in 1773, the British enacted a new law, the Tea Act. This act gave favorable tax breaks to the British East India Company so it could sell tea to the colonies at a price that undercut the American merchants who imported tea from the Dutch traders. So essentially, the colonists were forced to buy tea from the British East India Company. This did not sit well with the colonists. The Sons of Liberty decided to confront the British head-on. The general feeling was that the British had no right to tell the Americans who they could trade with. So on December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawks, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They destroyed more than 92,000 pounds of British tea by dumping it into the harbor. And this event came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. And to make the point that they were rebels rather than vandals, the Sons of Liberty made sure that no crew were harmed and no damage was done to the ships themselves. And the next day, they even replaced a padlock that had been broken. Now, many British East India Company shareholders were also members of Parliament, and this event really ticked the British government off. The British now firmly believed that the rebellious colonists in Massachusetts had to be tamed. So in the spring of 1774, the British Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor until restitution was paid for the destroyed tea. The local council and governments were disbanded, and the British military took direct control of Massachusetts. There was a very provocative provision within the Coercive Acts, which was the Quartering Act. This act allowed British military officials to demand accommodation for their troops in unoccupied houses and buildings across the American colonies, which meant that the American colonists had to pay for the expenses of housing and feeding these soldiers. The American colonists in general were alarmed that if the British could unilaterally dismantle the government in Massachusetts, they could do the same across the colonies. So they called for a Congress to organize a collective response and an enforced boycott of British goods. So between September and October of 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Prominent American leaders in attendance included George Washington, John and Samuel Adams, and Patrick Henry. 56 delegates from 12 colonies ultimately drafted a unified statement, which is also known as the Declaration and Resolves, which asserted the fundamental rights of the colonists, condemned the forced military presence in certain areas, and introduced a strict system of non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation of British goods. So essentially, a formal economic boycott of Great Britain. So what was the British response? Well, instead of trying to de-escalate the crisis, the British officials viewed these actions as an illegal challenge to the empire's sovereignty. King George III declared that the die is now cast and concluded that the colonies must either submit or triumph. The British government, on their part, by early 1775, officially declared Massachusetts to be in a state of open rebellion. Both sides now were preparing for war. By spring of 1775, American rebels were gathering arms and conducting drills. The British military command decided to proceed to Lexington to capture colonial leaders like Sam Adams and John Hancock, and then head to Concord and seize the gunpowder of the rebels. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be. As the British troops began boarding boats to cross the Charles River towards Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere and William Dawes were able to rouse the countryside and warn the leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British were leaving Boston and approaching Lexington to capture them. This enabled the American rebels to be prepared, and the British were forced to retreat. The two sides were now officially at war, and the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia starting May of 1775 with the primary purpose of creating a de facto wartime government. And this time, all 13 colonies participated. In July of 1775, the Olive Branch Petition was adopted by the Second Continental Congress, and it affirmed American loyalty to King George III and requested his intervention to resolve the colonial grievances. Wait, so despite the start of the war, the American leaders were still extending an olive branch to the British monarch? Why? There were a few reasons, but the primary reason was that the colonists were afraid of governing themselves. They were afraid that after getting rid of the British monarchy, the colonies could descend into chaos. But all this underwent a huge change in January of 1776, when writer-philosopher Thomas Paine published a pamphlet titled Common Sense. In the pamphlet, Paine launched a direct assault on the British monarchy, declaring King George III a royal brute. He argued that the concept of a king was a ridiculous violation of natural human equality. And he went on to write, "The law is king, rather than a monarch." Thomas Paine argued that independence offered Americans the unprecedented opportunity to govern themselves under a unique constitution that offered equality to all. This was the opportunity to create a democratic republic and secure the benefits of free trade. Since he had written this pamphlet in the common citizen's language, it became immensely popular. Over a population of 3 million, 120,000 copies were sold within a few months. It was read aloud in taverns and town squares and mobilized ordinary people and created a bottom-up mandate for independence. And within a short span of 5 months, the Continental Congress changed direction and initiated the Resolution for Independence on June 7, 1776. Years later, Founding Father John Adams would reflect on this pivotal moment in American history by stating, "Without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been wielded in vain." The Continental Congress selected a 5-man committee of 5 to draft the Declaration of Independence document. This committee comprised John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the initial draft because of his superior writing ability and also because he was from Virginia, like Richard Henry Lee, who had introduced the Resolution for Independence. After a few edits to the initial draft from Thomas Jefferson, the Second Continental Congress formally voted in favor of independence from Great Britain on July 2nd, 1776. And what we celebrate on July 4 is when Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Who's the only player in history to score a goal for his team and the opposition in a FIFA World Cup final? In the 2018 FIFA World Cup final between Croatia and France, Croatia's Mario Mandzukic accidentally headed a French free kick into his own goal in the 18th minute, becoming the first player to score an own goal in a World Cup final. But in the 69th minute, he scored a goal for Croatia, once again becoming the first player in history to score a goal for both sides in a FIFA World Cup final. So the answer is B, Croatia's Mario Mandzukic in the Croatia versus France 2018 final. Question for the current episode. When did the US officially gain independence? Was it A, September 3, 1783, B, July 5, 1776, C, January 17, 1781, or D, October 7, 1780? Once again, when did the US officially gain independence? Was it A, September 3, 1783, B, July 5, 1776, C, January 17, 1781, or D, October 7, 1780? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and will tune in again in 2 weeks for another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.